months, 1 million refugees escaped civil war in Syria. 1 million refugees whose houses have been turned into rubble, who have no place to live, who spend months on treacherous journeys to go to the other side of the world in the good hope that they'll get accepted by states who refuse to turn them in and send them back. We see this is the dire humanitarian situation we see in the world today. We see millions of refugees being refused the ability to actually stay in states and actually get the kind of rights that they deserve. So what do we define as refugees from humanitarian assistance? We see two types. Firstly, primarily the ones who face humanitarian crisis from war-torn regions. We're talking about people from Syria, from the Central African Republic, and places like South Sudan. We also see people who are facing sinking islands, right? We see long-term environmental refugees as well. So these are the two types of humanitarian refugees we'll be talking to you about today. Secondly, the whole notion of international monetary obligation. We see this is a two-tier definition. Firstly, for states that owe loans to international monetary institutions, whether they be International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, or people that contribute to their IMF or the World Bank, and the votes that they get within these organizations are determined by the amount that they actually give to these organizations in the first place. So, moving on to my policy. My policy is very simple. We aim to actually encourage states to get refugees because the amount of cost that they will spend on refugees, on the basic living conditions of the refugees, as determined by the United Nations Human High Commission for Refugees, will 1.5 times of that amount will be cancelled out of the principal debt that these states owe to these actually owe to these international monetary institutions. We see that states must actually ensure that they set up enclaves, right, or villages, and we see that there's going to be a self-contained economy where people from these refugee camps, if they stay there longer for 1 or 2 years, will actually set up economic roads and have an economy within these enclaves in the first place. We also say that we're going to send in advisors to regulate the living conditions of these camps as well. And we're also going to ensure that there are anti-corruption measures which are already in place when you actually owe the World Bank and IMF loans, so as to ensure that the cash flow is being justly and correctly being used for the refugee camps only. We say that, so moving on to my substantive, I as the first speaker will be speaking to you about how states have an incentive to actually to support refugees in our paradigm, and my second speaker will be talking to you about how we actually, on the long term, we actually protect the rights of refugees as well. Moving on to my first substantive on how we incentivize states to support refugees. The problem that we see today is that states do not support refugees. We see that it's either because of a lack of an ability to pay or a lack of a political will to pay. And this is bad, because I've already explained to you the kind of severe, dire conditions that these refugees are in. They have no place to live. They have no assured income. They have no ability to actually get basic needs met. Like, for example, eating food on a certain day. So we think that many refugees are out there who are homeless, who are starving, and in dire need of assistance. As a result, we realize that this is something that's of uttermost urgency. The more you stall this process, the more refugees are dying every day, the more refugees are smuggling themselves out of countries to get into other countries that who actually open their doors to refugees. Even then we see that these countries have a quota on the kind of refugees that they can accept. As a result, we realize that neighboring countries are in the best position to accept refugees in the first place. We think that these neighboring countries won't take in refugees because of two reasons. Firstly, because they aren't incentivized, or secondly, because they can't afford to. So how does actually cancelling the kind of monetary obligations actually incentivize them? Firstly, on the whole notion of states who owe huge monetary debt to these monetary institutions, right? We see that this kind of debt is crippling. We saw the case of Sierra Leone. No, thank you, madam. Or 70% of its GDP to the World Bank, right? And we think that as a result, they cannot spend the money on development because on actually imposing and improving the developmental standards of the country. For example, investing in infrastructure and the education of the people. As a result, we see, and more often than the time, the interest that they pay is greater than the amount of principal sum that we have. So how does our policy solve this? How incentivize them? They spend an amount to actually house these refugees and actually cancel out additional debt that is part of the principal sum. And why would this increase political will of these states in the first place? 3 reasons. Firstly, you reduce the severe council budgets. Because the principal sum owed is reduced, right, the overall interest and the overall amount that you owe over the course of time will be reduced. And we see that there is a track record of success for this policy. We saw this in the case of Peru, whose economy surged 20% when its entire debt was cancelled in 2008. So we see that cancelling debt does result in economic development of the country and tangible benefits for the country. Secondly, it reduces the credit rating of the country itself. Right? I'll take it in a moment, sir. Because we see that most of these countries, because they cannot actually repay the loans, they actually obtain junk bond status by these credit rating agencies. This repels investment by foreign investors. Yes, sir.
Tell me why, given that it is a law to protect refugees, why do we have to incentivize people to follow the law, given that it's a moral and legal obligation to do so?
We think that even if there's a moral legal obligation to do so, most states actually can't do this in the first place, right? Especially in the neighboring countries. It takes a lot to actually house refugees, especially if we're talking about housing refugees for 10 to 20 years, right? We think that it's very much based on the country's ability to actually pay for these refugees. And we talk about years of housing them, providing them electricity, providing them the kind of basic building, investing in schools, for example, in infrastructure for these refugee camps. As a result, we think that that kind of money is something that they don't have right now, as a result of the economic situation. Back to my substantive. Now, on the whole idea of junk bond status, we saw this in the case of Kenya, which hasn't been able to pay up its loans since the 1980s, right? And as a result, it actually deters investment in the long term. And this actually affects the kind of economic ability of these people. However, when you cancel the debt and you cancel the obligation to pay, you're actually increasing the credit rating and increasing the possibility of foreign investment, resulting in cumulative returns for the country. Lastly, we think that it increases the reputation of the country. Because we see that there's a lot more goodwill and also international standing when you actually have the ability and actually house refugees that in times of war, right? We think this is just something that will benefit the country. As a result, people will actually have increased political will and for this policy, because they will benefit more than the kind of amount that they have to spend in to actually house these refugees in the first place. So we think that we actively incentivize these states to do so. How about the second people? The second class of states, the states that actually don't owe any debt. We think that precisely because when you invest a lot of money, and the more money you invest in these international monetary institutions, the more kind of economic clout and the kind of voting power you have. So one, you cancel off that obligation, right? You make it easier for them to actually want to spend more and actually house these refugees in the first place. So in this case, you're incentivizing the majority of states out there that indeed have an obligation, but don't want to actually house these refugees. And this is beneficial because refugees have a greater scope of states that they can access for. Because we protect the rights of refugees, because we actively incentivize states, and because we relieve the debt burden of states, I'm very proud to propose.